Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Movies by McManus podcast where we break down movies, comics, TV, books, whatever kind of media you're into in the context of who created it, what effect it's trying to have on the world. And today is a different episode. We're obviously not together in the studio or a studio as we normally are. We're doing this over Zoom. This is an impromptu sort of podcast just to get the information out because as if you've clicked on this video, you're probably aware by now of the Long Island serial killer. The Gilgo Beach killer has been caught in me and my brother's hometown of Massapequa Park. We will be eventually in the studio breaking down this case further. But we wanted to give you something real quick, just so that you don't think we're not going to be addressing this at all. So I want to put it over to my brother, because Mike has been involved, has been kind of studying, kind of intrigued and appalled by this case kind of from the beginning. And of course, you had some news crews coming over to your studio to ask you questions as well. So Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Well, the word surreal has been thrown around a lot, and it's pretty apt. Greg, as you pointed out, this is a case that both of us have not only looked into on this show with our episode on Lost Girls, but just personally being from the area of Long Island. It's been one of the sort of strangest phenomenons in true crime, period. And having, being from the area, it was of particular interest. Um, when the news came down that they caught, and I do want to be clear that the alleged killer, the suspect, Rex Heuermann, they are tying him, they're indicting him on three murders. They are tying him to the Gilgo Four. He is heavily suspected. I think it's only a matter of time that he gets indicted on the fourth murder. But the murders that they're indicting him on are for Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amberlyn Costello at this time. Three out of the Gilgo Four, and then the fourth being Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who was actually the first to go missing back in 2007. Like I said, he is, the number one suspect, and it sure as hell is looking like it was him as well. I To my knowledge, there's some degradation of the DNA on the hair that was found with Maureen Brainerd Barnes on the belt. She was tied up with the belts. The belt piece of evidence they put out back in 2020, which they said had, either the letters uh, HM or WH. People have pointed out that Rex Heuermann's father, his name was William, I believed, so that would be fit with WH.
Right.
But one of the hairs found on the belt from Maureen, I believe, because of the being out in the elements for the amount of time that it was degraded to the point where I guess the mitochondrial DNA was not as readily available. But it seems pretty likely from everything that we're hearing and seeing that it's only a matter of time before Rex is indicted for Maureen. But back up just a few days, really, I woke up to a barrage of text messages um, on Friday morning that there was an arrest made in Massapequa, of all places, where Greg and I are from,
Yeah.
uh, in relation to the Gilgo case. Just can't describe. As Greg mentioned too, I've been on a number of news shows from CBS to ABC to News 12. Supposed to be doing News Nation as well. I was in Newsday, which is the Long Island paper. we're been saying shocked but not surprised. Shocked in the sense that I don't think anyone, wakes up and says, "Oh, there's probably a serial killer in my hometown." Not surprised in the sense that the location makes all the sense in the world when you take into account some of the cell phone pings, which we're going to dive into. But what were publicly available, specifically with Melissa's phone pinging in Massapequa, obviously proximity to Ocean Parkway and Gilgo, and the fact that uh, it was widely speculated that this person was a commuter who was working in the city, excuse me, and living on Long Island, which is obviously a very common thing for people that live on Long Island. But um, just to go back to that morning, I was in my gym clothes. I made a decision to stop over at the location. I was not expecting to be on television, but what ended up happening was, excuse me, what ended up happening was as I got close to the house, I ended up parking. I ended up walking up to the scene. I asked one of the Suffolk police officers, which was interesting to see because, as Long Islanders will know, Massapequa is not in Suffolk County, which it had been reported inaccurately. Not the end of the world. It's the last town in Nassau, but it is Nassau County. So the fact that you saw Suffolk County set up in Massapequa was interesting because that's not something you see every day. But you saw sort of, I don't know the names of the vehicles exactly, but large investigation style vehicles, almost like something you'd see out of a Netflix documentary with a hostage situation. I mean, just big giant trucks, and I don't even think you could call it trucks, like just big, almost look like the types of vehicles you'll see on a movie set or something like that, like just those giant, um, homicide squad and detectives. And uh, I asked one of the officers, where the media was located. He directed me a couple blocks away to where that was. I started live streaming just on my personal Instagram account. And this was 9 o'clock, 8:45 in the morning, as it was all going down, as it was being reported that his name had not even been released to the media, or it might have just been released to the media, because I know by the time I woke up to those text messages, his name wasn't even out there yet.
Well, I had heard, and I sent you a photo of this. I got a photo of Rex Heuermann, and they said his name because there were some people on Reddit who looked up who owned that house. And
Right.
so it was on Reddit, this who owns the house, this who we believe the suspect is. On the internet, at least I saw it maybe at least an hour before the news was reporting it. But yeah, we all knew from the beginning Massapequa at least played a role in this case because of those cell phone records. I don't think anyone expected the killer to actually be living here. I have a few friends who live maybe like 2 or 3 houses down. I have one friend who lives literally across the street from the killer. Um, we all knew because of those phone records that came from a well-known, very sketchy motel in Massapequa. Um, that's it wouldn't be surprising that the killer stopped there. That I don't think anyone was surprised about. Um, and once again, like when you find out the killer was from Massapequa, um, it's surprising. It's shocking. The shocking is more the right word than surprising because when you look at it, it makes perfect sense. You're 20 minutes from the beach. You're in the middle of the night. You could be in the beach. 20 minutes in the middle of nowhere, Ocean Parkway. And if you're leaving Massapequa 1:30, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, no one's going to see you. And you can be back and forth before anybody even realizes that you're gone.
Absolutely.
Another so we'll bring up before that he is charged with 3 of the killings, lead suspect in the 4th, and I think what's important to bring up is the reason he was arrested now, while the 4th case is still kind of being built against him. The reason that they didn't wait for all 4 cases to be fully built so that they could charge all 4 at once is because it was very clear from looking at his purchases and online activity that he was planning on killing again.
Well, there's a couple of there's a couple of things to that. Firstly, as you pointed out, and I had heard too, the cell phone ping. I believe they had at one time investigated a hotel in Massapequa. My understanding of the cell phone ping in Massapequa was that Melissa Bartholomew's cell phone had last pinged in Massapequa. Um, Going into the bail application, which we're going to dive into today, they don't mention, to my knowledge, the hotel. There's also some other revelations that we've never heard of before. So we're going to get into that. Um, as far as the reason for taking him in now, I've heard two theories um, that were put out both by Ray Tierney and the police commissioner of Suffolk, Rodney Harrison. The first of which, to your point, was um, look, this guy, by all accounts, never stopped some of those activities, which are utilizing burner phones. He was caught just in May of this year, a couple of months ago, going into a store in New York City and purchasing more minutes on a burner phone. He was found when he was arrested with a burner phone on him, and he was under surveillance, basically from what it sounds like, 24-hour surveillance for almost a year. Um, if not longer than a year, since they've been on to him since March 14th of 2022. But some of the activities, reaching out to sex workers, utilizing the burner phones, that, hey, maybe this guy was going to strike again. Rodney Harrison seems to have thrown a little bit of cold water on that since in the last couple of days. But one thing they were definitely mindful of was now that the evidence was sort of piling up here, basically being afraid of leaks, that, hey, if this guy gets word that we're basically onto him at this point, is he a flight risk? Is he going to leave town? So those were sort of the two theories that we heard there. And then just to kind of get back to the morning of when the Suffolk police officer showed me where the media was, and I was live streaming as this information was coming out. Eyewitness News was the first, and they were kind of going around looking for neighbors to speak to. It became very clear to me that there wasn't going to be anyone there who knew the case better than I did. So I offered to speak to them. What ended up happening was I said a couple of sentences. It was pretty clear to them that okay, this guy knows the case. And before I knew it, there was, I was surrounded by media. It was a very, very odd thing. Um, and we ended up, like Greg said at the top of the call, having News 12 come down a couple days later to our studio here that we run, and we did a piece with them. So, to find out that, the serial killer is in your hometown, and then to be somewhat of a mouthpiece to represent the hometown, I guess is fitting, really, if I'm being honest, because
Yeah. No.
we are from, we have looked into this. I mean, they in our hometown newspaper of Newsday and on News 12, they gave Movies by McManus a shout out, but obviously
Yeah.
we are just one entity that's been looking into this. I want to give personal thanks to also the Lisk Long Island Serial Killer podcast with my friends Chris Moss and Shannon McGarvey. They do just an absolutely fabulous job. Josh Zeman, who I also consider an acquaintance, at least some interactions over online over the past few years. He did a phenomenal job with the killing season, along with Rachel Mills, and Josh has still been keeping the word out there, very active with that, and obviously Bob Colker too, with Lost Girls, among others. But yeah, I mean, how are you feeling towards all of this? I know I had a chance to speak my mind quite a bit in the media, and you're from Massapequa too, and what are you thinking?
Um, it's just crazy. So I never thought this was going to get solved, which I guess nowadays you can't really get away with murdering someone. You know, you really can't. With DNA evidence. So I guess it was kind of weird for me, but to I had this idea in my head. I was just like, you know what? I don't think that they're ever going to get this guy because one, and this was a theory that was going on around not only online but with a lot of people who followed the case, believing that the killer had some connection to the Suffolk County Police Department, specifically with the former chief of police James Burke. And I was under this the at least that was what I believed was like the reason why he was able to commit these killings and get away with it was because of some connection with James Burke and Suffolk County. I think that looking back, that was kind of just like the wild story that like people came up with their head. I mean, the situation with James Burke and Suffolk County, I don't know how much you want to go into it here, kind of takes on a life of its own. It is such an insane story that look, it wasn't out of the realm of possibilities that that murders happened. I mean, it would definitely be fitting of the story, but I think that kind of it's stuck in people's mind and it's stuck in my mind too, and I kind of became convinced that like somehow this was part of the story, that somehow like the killer had to be connected to these guys also. um I also thought maybe, he was already arrested and in prison for other killings. And I literally never thought I would see the day that we knew for sure. Some things become such a mystery in your mind and you have so many theories around them, and there's so many like loose answers and loose questions, and you really don't know. You're trying to connect the dots and you come up with your own ideas, and then you find new evidence that contradicts the ideas that you came up with. And it's so crazy to me that like one of the like big mysteries of kind of like my life and our lives has been
Yeah.
solved. I was a junior in high school when these killings happened. I'm 30 years old now. For a large period of my life, that was a big question of like, you remember this like shocking thing that happened to everyone in Long Island. I mean, um, a, just this shocking like event. I say, it happened to everybody in Long Island, which, it really didn't. I don't want to like make
Oh,
it
I know what you mean. I
yeah,
know what you mean.
that's the thing. Like, I don't want the victims to get lost in all of this, but that is something of just like this shocking thing that happened. No one knew who did it, and it was such a big mystery. And I didn't think we were ever going to get the answer. Um, and it's just crazy that we finally do.
Well, I mean, I do think, and I agree with everything you said. I do think that it's important to point out that the Long Island serial killer, at large, if you will, or at large rather, um, is not entirely solved yet because, for starters, still have to tie him to Maureen, which they're going to. But then you have Asian male, you have Fire Island Jane Doe, you have the toddler, you have Peaches, who's the toddler's mother, you have Valerie Mack, you have Jessica Taylor. Um, you have a lot of unanswered questions. Now, uh, two things you pointed out. Was the killer already arrested? I had that thought too.
Yeah.
I've been pretty vocal about my feelings on John Bittroff as a potential candidate for
And
Lisk.
Rex Heuermann had Googled John Bistroff.
Yeah,
So it
and
seemed
we're
like
gonna get into the bail application, and
yeah, it seemed like he was aware of that theory as well.
right. The more I'm thinking of it, though, they've had John Bittroff now, and the reason we should give some context that John Bittroff is a good candidate is he is a basically well, he's a confirmed serial killer of sex workers on Long Island. Let's
Yeah.
just start there. Secondly, you have the fact that he lives in Manorville. If you look on a map, extremely close to where Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack were located. Now they were also located on Ocean Parkway. Their bodies were located in both locations. But then you think about it and you're like, okay, well, John Bittroff has been in custody since 2017, I believe. Probably by now, if they had DNA on any of these victims, which it turns out now we know they did, at least on the Gilgo Four, he would have been found out, years earlier. So now I'm leaning, John Bittroff's not the killer of the Gilgo Four. The only reason he wouldn't be the killer of the Manorville victims and the rest of the victims is if there just wasn't DNA to tie him there.
Well, that's also
But
seems
now I'm feeling
yeah, that seems a
there
little
probably
ridiculous,
is
you know?
there probably is DNA on those other victims,
Yeah.
and they probably have excluded John Bittroff at this point. So, when we say like, everyone's saying the Long Island serial killer has been caught, you could say, yes, maybe. At least one of them has been. But until we could either tie him to the rest of the victims or exclude him, there's still a shitload of work that needs to be done.
No, no, I agree. And when you phrase it like that, it actually does make sense. I mean, the idea that a there's the Gilgo Four and then seven other sets of remains that were found there. The idea that none of those seven had the DNA of the killer on it seems a
Not
little
likely.
out of the realm of possibility. Just knowing I've worked on, murder investigation shows myself, and there's always DNA evidence. It just like you can't go somewhere and not leave DNA. It just doesn't happen. Um, I want to get back
Um,
to um Lost Girls and kind of the story around this because one of the things I want to bring this up and what Lost Girls, both the book and the movie, do that's fantastic is that the focus is always on the victims. And that's something that I really like personally with this podcast, and like what I think everyone should keep in mind is that um the victims and the victims family, like no one should ever lose sight of that. There's been kind of we've talked about this on the show before, but especially with like some are criticizing the new Jeffrey Dahmer show about this. Some have criticized a lot of murder documentaries in the past of this, of kind of focusing on the killer, glamorizing might not be the best words, but for lack of a better word, glamorizing the killer. And what I like about Lost Girls, and especially what I've seen from people covering this case so far, is a focus on the victims. These were girls who had dreams of their own, who had families of their own, mothers, um, and their families, because the families are very much victims as well, you know. From the case of that, they have this severe trauma that for years no one was really helping them with. That for years they, and Lost Girls talks about this a lot, were kind of ignored. And in addition to the fact that the killer was literally contacting family members, at least one that we know of. Um, So I wanted to bring that point up as well.
It's it needs to be brought up, and some people have done a better job than others. I think Robert Colker did the best job,
Yeah.
where his book really was about the victims. A lot of the coverage is very entertainment leaning, and they're making it about Rex Heuermann, and understandably so. It's a giant news story. It just broke. Everyone wants to know who the hell this guy is.
Well, this is
But
um
it's
not to cut you off, but this is kind of something that I agree, and it's kind of annoyed me about the coverage so far. I'm not gonna name anyone specifically, but it's there's a narrative in the news that's covering this case right now that Rex was kind of like a quiet, unassuming guy who, he's like the neighbor next door, and no one would have thought, he could do something like this. I know people who
yeah,
knew him, whose neighbor. That's the furthest from the case. Everybody said this guy was a creep. This guy was weird around children. He was the type of guy who on Halloween the kids were told not to trick or treat at his door. And this idea of like a normal, quiet dude from the suburbs who's totally unassuming, who it couldn't be further from the truth because he wasn't that, because he wasn't your friendly neighbor. Multiple people saw him and right away was like, yeah, that guy is a creep.
yeah. I mean, there's already been people coming out. You had his neighbor to the back of him who had to confront him because Rex was peering into his yard, looking at his wife sunbathing. You have him stealing from Whole Foods in Massapequa, which just boggles my mind. I might have been in Whole Foods with him. I'm sure I probably was at one point.
Yeah.
Um, you have the fact that he got into a confrontation with a former police officer on the Long Island Railroad a few days before he was arrested, and he was yelling at. So this guy was a menace. Even people at his architecture firm. I don't think we've discussed the fact that he's a 59-year-old man from Massapequa Park. He was an architect and an architectural consultant, like an expediter in Manhattan, and he was known to be very rough with people. And also, even if he was this sort of like quiet next door neighbor, why is that still a narrative that anyone gives a shit about? Like, are you trying to tell me like people from quiet town? Oh, it was such a quiet community. Some of the biggest monsters in the world are from the suburbs. I mean, that's the whole thing. The suburbs is like the onion that you just peel back the layers to. We don't know that in 2023. Like, what
Anyone,
that's such a like old
yeah,
mentality concept.
anyone who lives on Long Island, who's from Long Island, understands that there is a dark history here. That you peel back the layers, and there's a lot. Our even our highway systems are designed that way for dubious reasons. There is a long history. You read I already forget the James Burke book. You might remember the name. But if you read about
King, Jimmy the King by
Jimmy the
Gus
King,
Garcia Roberts.
yes, and if you read that, then you understand um the dark like racism. We're one of the most segregated places in America still in 2023. And they this idea that we live in a quiet, unassuming place is just not true, you know.
Right.
Or maybe it's true if it's true if you're white, upper middle class, and you can ignore all the dark history, all the violence and everything that happened to get you here, you know. If you can
You know,
ignore that. But the idea that that this isn't a place where people can be violent and do horrific and violent things just is not true.
right. I mean, and I just it's like it's kind of amazing like that was said on the news so many times. Oh, in this quiet community, it's like we don't know that bad people are everywhere at this point. But to your
And
point, go ahead.
Massapequa specifically, we have had and still going on a massive opioid epidemic that that has led to a bunch of crime here. One of the jokes that was like uh that was going around when they referred to Massapequa as a sleepy neighborhood. They were like, "Yeah, it's sleepy because everyone's on heroin."
That's pretty good.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I mean, to your point earlier, and about James Burke, you know, and I said this, it didn't air. One of the things you realize is like, man, they really do fucking just chop a little bit of what you say and put it out there. Like I spoke at length to most outlets, and they boil you down to like 30 seconds. But anyway, one thing I was bringing up is, you know why the reason that everyone thought James Burke and the Suffolk County Police were involved, because they weren't telling us anything. And when you don't communicate, people speculate. And
yeah,
not only were they not communicating, the early administrations, James Burke and Tom Spoda, they were obstructing justice. They were keeping the FBI out of the investigation. Now let's take a look at what's
yeah,
going on here. And now and as we know, they both ended up in federal prison, not related to the Long Island serial killer case, but because of their own corruption, of which they ended up in federal prison. They didn't want the FBI looking at them, so they kept the FBI out. And when you do things like that, you look really suspicious. And then you add no communication on top of that, no updates for years at a time. People say, "Well, what are you hiding?" Um,
yeah. So you're saying you criticized the police department and local news media didn't put that to air? Oh, wow, very interesting. I'm joking around, you know.
yeah, I mean, one thing that I got some slack with just from like my idiotic friends who just like to talk shit is they're like, "Oh, look at you, look at you defending the police." And it's like, okay, like here's the deal, right? So again, you have previous administrations who weren't doing anything to
Yeah.
further the case. You have previous administrations that were obstructing the case. Um, you have 13 years that this case went unsolved, when there are, anywhere from 10, or some consider it to be more than that, that could be linked, as far as bodies and victims. So let's take a look at what happens when you have people that actually seem motivated to get something done. Well, you have a new administration with Raymond Tierney, the new district attorney, and you have a new administration at the police commissioner position, who is Rodney Harrison. In It's been reported, I've seen both January and February, but regardless, either January or February of 2022, they set up the Gilgo Task Force, which included Suffolk County, Nassau County, the FBI, and the New York State Police. There might have been some others, but basically they're collaborating and they're saying, look, we want to put basically an all-star team together here to try to get to the bottom of this. Well, in March of 2022, again, do the math on that. That's 2 months into the creation of the task force, a month and a half, depending on what you put that starting point. They identify A member of the New York State Police identifies Rex Heuermann as a potential suspect. It's been reported that the first identifying mark was because of a vehicle he owned. What is it? Shoot, I can't remember the name of the vehicle off the top of my head. A Chevy Avalanche is what it was, a first generation Chevy Avalanche. Um, so then they were able to look into the records of who owned the Avalanche. They were able to, find the location. So now all of a sudden we have a Chevy Avalanche first generation owner, of which there were like a dozen or so. So it wasn't a lot of people. Credit to Chris and Shannon from Lisk for pointing that out. It was a very small amount of people that had that vehicle, and they identified at least one of these people before they knew as Rex, as living in Massapequa Park. So now you have Massapequa Park and the vehicle. And what hasn't been known before this all came out is that they also developed something called the box, which There's an area within Massapequa Park related to the cell phone towers where both the burner phone, I should say, all the burner phones, the victims' phones, and Rex Heuermann's personal cell phone all had activity. So now you had someone in the box with that vehicle. And then we'll get into some of the other evidence when we go through the bail application. But uh, it's amazing what happens when you just have you're collaborating, you're sharing your information, and you're working towards a goal as opposed to working against the goal. Um,
Well, it seems
Unbelievable.
it's the simple fact that this administration wanted to get this case solved and the other administration didn't, or it just wasn't a priority to them, or it wasn't something that they specifically cared about, which is a shame because what, it took them a month to label uh Rex
6 weeks
suspect,
from
6
when
weeks.
6 weeks from when they
So
started the task force.
yeah, and it really is a shame. Look, it's a shame that, the last of the Gilgo killing was in 2010, so 13 years ago. If he did kill somebody else before then, in that time, in the 13, and they could have caught him sooner, and they just didn't. Where the tragedy in that, you know, the tragedy in that it just the previous administration, they were doing their own thing. James Burke and his boys, they were doing their own thing, and that's a shame because in 6 weeks of the task force starting, you have him as a suspect already. There's zero reason of why the previous administration couldn't have solved this. I mean,
And
obviously, I don't
and
know everything, but just seems to me it seems to me that this could have been caught. This could have been done way sooner. And if there are other victims in that time, well, then that's a tragedy.
Yeah, and look, James Burke and Tom Spoto have been gone for a long time. So we're not just talking about one previous administration. We're talking about multiple. You had some people trying to do some things right. You had Geraldine Hart and you had Tim Sini, who at least they put some information out there with the release of the belt. But nobody thought to put this task force together until Rodney Harrison and Ray Tierney. Rodney Harrison gets into office, and you go, boom, Shannon Gilbert call, boom, Megan Waterman Hop Hog Hotel video footage never before seen. Then finally, boom, task force, and we have a suspect on the radar.